that I would like to talk about, of course, is the fact that we also have surveys. Now, as I mentioned earlier, surveys are a great way, they're a fantastic way to gather descriptive information from a participant or a population in the greater context of things. Now, a survey, what makes it important? Well, the first thing that makes it unique is that it will have a set of questions. It actually has questions that are geared towards the hypotheses or towards the research method or research question that you are trying to answer. The good thing about surveys is that they allow us to gather information in an immensely quick, immensely beneficial, because it takes a short amount of time. They're usually not expensive. They're usually pretty good. And you're able to administer to a wide variety of persons, to a great number of persons, without having to break funding, without having to ruin your pocket, or if you're having a grant, without having to use much of the money for that research. So notice that they're cost effective, you're able to reach a great population, but also notice that there are some limitations with surveys. Now, if we go back to our slides, there could be aspects of a sampling error. What do I mean by that? Well, it's because the errors that come from administering a survey, they come inherently with the application of a survey. So think about people who choose to do the survey. So for instance, let's say that you're going to be having a survey, right? That you are invited to conduct a survey. Now, when you're invited to conduct the survey, you notice that it's about politics. You may not be interested whatsoever in the world of politics. So because you're not interested, but you're part of the general population, you decide, I'm not going to participate in the survey. But notice that someone who's really into politics, they will say, yeah, let's do it. Let's go ahead and conduct this research, and I should say survey. But notice that because of that selection, the self-selection, you volunteer for this participation, we're going to have a form of bias, because it's likely that the people who answered the survey are the ones that are interested in politics. Just the population that was interested in politics. So I can get a good understanding of the rest of the population, just your average Joe or your average Jane, because they simply chose not to participate. So now as a researcher, if I wanted to conduct research about politics, notice that only a specific group of people will likely participate, because it could be simply because of the topic, amongst many other things that could contribute in the participation of a research. And that's something you will cover much in detail during your graduate studies. But for now, what is important for us is understanding surveys, what they're used for, how are they beneficial, and what are their downfalls. So another thing that I like to mention, if we go back to our slides, let's look at another downfall of surveys. Now, within surveys, we may have the problem of having a poorly phrased question. Why is that? Because one of the downfalls of research questions, or rather, I should say, survey questions, is that within the survey question, we want to make sure that our language is accurate. We want to make sure that the questions are actually intended to measure what we're trying to measure. So for example, we don't want to put language or make the question so unreasonable that the person will get confused in the process and not even be able to give us a good understanding of their answer. So for instance, you may have had experience with this yourself. Think about a time when you took a test and the question was entirely too long. The wording, the length of the question, the words that they use, structure of the sentence was just plain confusing. And then when you were trying to answer that question in your exam, you simply could not understand the question, if nothing else, because it was too long, because the wording was confusing. So if we can do that for a test, we can also make the same mistake for a survey. So notice how, in this sense, we want to be careful with our surveys. We want to make sure that the question is indeed intended and that it has good structure. Now, the other downfall of survey questions is that we may utilize biased language. We can actually use language that is going to be detrimental for the question. What do I mean by that? I can put a question, I can create a survey question that can have the person be biased towards a direction, whether it be because they're doing it towards a negative or towards a positive. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So let's think about if you are asked questions about, say, for example, food, your food preferences. So if I say, you never want to eat breakfast in the morning. Now, the problem with that question, the word never can actually be a form of bias, because now that you heard the term never, that can guide you towards the negative side of things, or I don't like eating breakfast, or eating breakfast is a bad thing, or things of that nature. You want to be careful about how you word a question, because now it sounds like we're leaning towards the negative. We're leaning towards saying, no, I don't like breakfast in the morning, and neither do I like anything else. So we can set the tone basically for the rest of the survey. Now, there are instances in using those terms can be correct. So for example, if we're doing a scale, right? So if we're doing a scale of I never want to hang out with my friends, and all the way towards I always want to hang out with my friends. So there are instances in that type of question being adequate, but we're thinking more about a scale. Right now, we're thinking more about a survey, just a general understanding of what that description is for yourself, whether or not you like to have breakfast in the morning or not, if you like to eat waffles in the middle of the night versus eating them in the morning. So notice that we can gauge that behavior. Say, for example, for those of you who are interested in industrial psychology and consumer psychology, that would be a question that you would ask to the average participant. Now, let's go back to our slide. Now, we have talked about correlation a little bit before, and now we're going to go a little bit more in detail in regards to correlation. Now, a correlation, when we're thinking about correlation, let's think about a relationship. That's the only thing we are trying to do, is to examine a relationship between variables, between something that we are trying to look into. So if I am thinking about examining the relationship between heat and test performance, notice that each prediction, each variable, one variable is going to be used to test a prediction. So for instance, the higher the temperature in the classroom, the more poorly the person is going to behave and going to conduct their test, right? They're going to have poor marks in their test. So there we have a potential correlation for our hypotheses, right? So we're trying to find out whether that relationship in fact does exist. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't take anything else from this video, learn that one of the problems of a correlation is that they do not imply causation. They do not imply a cause. Simply because something is related does not mean that is the cause of your behavior. That is not the cause of the observed phenomena. So as I mentioned earlier, think about the example that I gave you about shoe size is related to better test performance. Well, think about children have smaller shoe sizes. So if I gave them a test in calculus, likely going to perform more poorly than if I gave that test, the same calculus test, to an adult. So yes, there is a relationship. That was not the cause. The cause was education. The amount of education that they had in math would actually be a better predictor when in a better explanation of a cause more than shoe size when it comes to their performance in a calculus test. Now, this is where you're going to see your cause and effect. As I stated earlier, in an experiment, this is your go-to when it comes to understanding a cause, trying to identify a cause. Now, why is it that we can actually look into a cause in an experiment? That is because we are able to do many things. The first thing is we are able to manipulate the independent variable. Now, what is an independent variable? An independent variable is a variable that we can manipulate. So for instance, in the example that I gave you earlier, we talked about temperature. Temperature in the classroom is indeed manipulated by me just changing the thermostat, by me opening the windows, by me bringing in fans, right? So I am able to manipulate that independent variable because I have the control of that independent variable. Now, interestingly, another thing that we need to look into is the dependent variable. What is the dependent variable? Now, the dependent variable is that variable that is affected by the independent variable. So for instance, in the case that I was presenting earlier about temperature, the dependent variable could be their anger, right? So it could be the anger that they feel because the room is hot. So that would be our dependent variable. Notice that the independent variable will have an impact on the dependent variable, right? So we have our temperature, and our temperature impacted our anger. So it would have a direct influence within our dependent variable. Now, generally, when we think about the independent variable, we like to think about manipulation. And when we're talking about the dependent variable, we generally think about how are we going to measure. So for example, how am I going to measure anger? I can have a survey, I can have a scale from 1 to 10, how are you feeling? Or how angry are you feeling? So we can do a scale, 0, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. There's many ways that I can try and measure anger. Now, interestingly, despite of control, right? So let's talk about control for a minute. So when we're thinking about control, we're thinking about how are we going to reduce the influence of other variables? How am I going to reduce that influence of the variables? So for instance, if I want to control the environment for an experiment, in this case, we're going to control the environment of, say, for example, the temperature, right? I am worried about the temperature in the room because that's my independent variable, and that's what I'm going to use to manipulate this dependent variable. Now, there are other things that can influence the test taker's ability for that test, right? So in keeping with that same example, I want to find out if temperature is related to test performance. What other things can be influenced by test performance? For example, the student went out to party the night before the test. The student did not study for the test. The student was nervous before the test. So notice that there are many variables in this scenario that I cannot control. I couldn't control the fact that that one student went out to party before he or she took the test. So that would be an extraneous variable. It's something that was outside of my control that I could not control during the exposure of that independent variable. I was simply not able to control for that variable. Now, generally in experiments, we like to find out, hey, what is likely? What can actually happen that can ruin the experiment? So for example, I can ask students before they begin their test, did you sleep okay? Did you get 8 hours of sleep? Did you study for this test? Did you study at least 10 hours for this test? Did you manage to eat well? Did you have breakfast? Did you not have breakfast? And test their anxiety before they show up to actually take the test. because I'm trying to control for those variables. I'm trying to make sure that those variables have the least amount of impact. Why am I interested in that? Why do I want it to not influence my study? Why is that? I want to be able to eliminate any other explanation as to why that student is angry while taking the exam other than the temperature. I want to make sure that I can justify that it was the temperature, in fact, and not another variable, not another factor that influenced that student's, that measurement of anger or that measurement of doing poorly in their exam. I want to make sure that I can show that I did as much as possible to control for those variables that could be outside of my control. Now, granted, a good experiment will have a lot of control. A good experiment would have complete control of the independent variable. A good experiment will also have an adequate measurement for the dependent variable. But there's always limits to how much control can we have, right? Now, this is where our next form of study comes into play. So let's go to our slides. So something that I like to mention about the experiments is that sometimes we will not be able to control for that independent variable. And when we are exposed to not being able to control for the independent variable, we're going to look into a quasi-experiment approach. Now, we will definitely cover that in much more detail, but I do want you to know that there's instances in which we cannot control, we cannot manipulate that variable. So for instance, if I want to see the impacts of a hurricane, for example, I want to see the impacts of Hurricane Katrina here in the US, in the mainland, or if I want to see the impacts of Hurricane Maria in the tropics, right? I cannot control for a hurricane. I cannot make a hurricane happen, right? And that will be impossible for me as a researcher to just wish a hurricane to occur, so that way I can manipulate how strong that hurricane was, category 1, category 2. So notice it is impossible in some instances to control for everything, and it's impossible to manage that independent variable. So notice that in this specific case, I would move towards a quasi-experiment, which it's basically a true experiment without the manipulation of this independent variable. Now, as I mentioned, a good experiment has the manipulation of the independent variable, it has the measurement of the dependent variable, and it also has a control group. So the basic experiment, what does that look like? Well, we talked about the control group earlier, right? And the control group is the group that is not exposed to the treatment. So for example, in the illustration that I gave you earlier, we had the group that was going to be given a pill, and then we had the group that was not going to be given a pill. So notice that the group that was not given the pill, that is the group that we are talking about that would be the control, because I want to see their symptoms as they happen, right? So if I come up with a new medication to control for fever within 5 minutes, people who are experiencing fevers, we will let them occur naturally, right? Now, there's of course a lot of ethical things about that we will discuss in depth in other videos. But for now, remember that the control group is the one that did not receive that treatment, that they did not receive that independent variable. Now, something interesting about control groups, if we go back to our slides, notice that control groups, they provide a baseline. They let us see, I should say, things as they happen. They let us see how is this occurring, right? In its natural, common, non-intervention environment, which is exactly what we want to do. It is exactly what we want to see in a control group. How are things going to unfold without my treatment? How are things going to unfold without my independent variable? So by the same token, let's look at a treatment group. Now, this is a group we were talking about earlier that we said, this is the group that will be exposed to my manipulation. They will be exposed to my independent variable. This group is the one that's going to receive the treatment. We generally refer to this group as the treatment group, the one that actually received the intervention. Now, the whole point of the treatment group is to see whether or not we actually had a change, to see whether or not there was an effect, if there was a reaction towards that independent variable. That is the whole point of a treatment group. Now, something really interesting that you will see, for example, in a lot of these channels or products, and they'll tell you, hey, my product was tested and we saw a difference. And they will say, oh, if you buy my product, I can tell you, we already know, we tested it and there is a difference, right? As compared to what, right? Different to what? Did you have a control group that did not receive access to your treatment or your pill or your product, right? You tend to see that a lot with some of the equipment, brand new equipment that's coming up. So if they're telling you, hey, if you use my product, you can rest assured that it's going to work because we saw changes in the group that we gave it to in our trials. Where, well, that's fantastic, but where's your control group? Did it actually reflect changes that would have happened? Or for all we know, they would have happened naturally. They would just occur as they were going to occur, as they were going to unfold. So keep in mind that just because there is a change, if you have nothing to compare it to, then for all we know, it's just a change that would have occurred anyways without your intervention, without your treatment, without your manipulation of that independent variable. So always keep that in mind. Now let's go back to our slides. Now, in an experiment, it's also important for you to remember that we can also manipulate more than one factor, right? We are able to manipulate more than one thing. So let's go back to the example that I was giving during this presentation about, we are going to look into, okay, room temperature affecting test performance and emotions, right? It's going to affect their anger. Now, think about, is heat and temperature the only thing I'm doing, right? Well, that's not true. I can do many things. I can do other things that can influence the dependent variable. So maybe I'm not only interested in the variable of heat, maybe if I use red ink in the exam, they would also perform poorly, right? So if I print out the exams and I give my students red ink exams, they may also become more angry and they may also perform poorly. So notice that I can include multiple variables, right? I can actually do that. There's other statistical measures that I have to conduct though, in order to see whether or not there was influence. And keep in mind that you can do that. However, it does take other processes in order to see whether or not heat plus ink had an impact, if just ink had the impact, or if just heat had the impact, or neither. They may not have had an impact individually, but maybe they had an impact together towards that dependent variable. So notice that there are other statistical processes that you can do in order to measure which one or if both actually had an impact. Now, this is a topic that a lot of people confuse, validity and reliability. Now, that tends to happen early on in your social sciences studies, or it can happen for our peers in the hard sciences field. But a lot of people confuse the term validity with reliability. What is that? What are these terms? Validity simply means whether or not we are indeed measuring what we want to measure, right? So for example, I want to measure inches, or I want to measure feet, and want to measure miles or kilometers, right? So if I wanted to measure that with a thermometer, that is not a valid use of that instrument, right? I cannot measure distance with a thermometer because it's simply not intended for that purpose, right? It's like trying to bake a cake with a hammer, right? Now we need an oven for that. So notice that validity simply means I am measuring what I am in fact trying to measure, right? And this sounds pretty simple, but in reality, we make that mistake all the time. And that is why sciences come in, right? So for example, I can say, because of the way a person shook my hand, I can say if they're trustworthy. Well, is shaking hands a valid measure for trustworthiness, right? So we make that mistake all the time, right? And for all we know, it could be, but the only way to test that would be through an experiment. Now, validity has there's different, I should say, methods of validity, right? There's internal validity. So in this case, we can achieve that control. We can achieve internal validity through having a control, right? So if we have a control group, we're going to be able to understand whether or not there was that consistency, that we actually did in fact measure what we were trying to measure. Now, another thing is we can look into how are we going to generalize this information, right? Because it might have worked for the group in how we were measuring things, but this is when we look into external validity, right? So in external validity, let's imagine a group, right? Let's imagine a group that we are trying to study, right? And if this information does not help or does not apply towards the measurement of another group, then probably you weren't measuring what you thought you were measuring, right? Because if I'm trying to measure anger, right? If I'm trying to measure anger and say all of my students scored a certain way, that seems internally consistent, right? When compared to the control group that didn't have their temperature change in the classroom. But then if I grab the same exact scale and I use it with another group, and it turns out it seemed to measure something else or nothing at all, maybe my instrument wasn't valid. Maybe I was not using a valid measurement and a valid definition of that term. Now let's go back to our slides. Now, let's think about reliability. What is reliability? Now, the thing about reliability is that this term, the term of validity and the term of reliability tend to be interchanged. They tend to be confused. People confuse one with the other. So a lot of people tend to confuse these terms often. But hopefully after today, that won't be a problem for you. Now, let's think about reliability. What is reliability? We simply mean that that measurement is consistent. We actually can see it over and over again, right? So let's think about, and as it's here, let's think about a ruler, right? So think about if you're trying to measure a table or a desk in your house, right? You're trying to measure something. You get out the measuring tape, you whip out the measuring tape, you're trying to measure that table. And every time you measure this table, it's 25 inches long, every time. And you grab your measuring tape, and you put it back on the table, and it turns out, yes, it is still 25 inches. And if you do it tomorrow, if you do it a year from now, it's still going to give you the same measurement. Of course, if nothing changed, you can use the same tape measure, put it on top of the table, and it's going to be reliable because it's going to give you a consistent measurement. It's going to give you a consistent result over and over again as time goes by. Now, that doesn't mean just because something is reliable, it does not mean that it's valid, right? So as we know, my measuring tape, every time I put it on that table, it's reliable. I get the same measurement every time. But if I grab the same measuring tape and I'm trying to gauge temperature, is it valid? It's not valid because it's not measuring what it's intended to be measured, right? That measuring tape is only intended to measure the inches, right? Or the feet, whereas it's not a valid measure. So to measure temperature, because that's why we have thermometers. Thermometers are valid to measure temperature. By the same token, if I grab that thermometer, put it on the table to measure inches, that was a valid measurement for and a reliable measure for temperature, but it's not a reliable measure. It's not a valid measure when it comes to a table. So notice that we would need both things in order for them to be used in an experiment. I need a measure that it's valid, and I also need a measure that it's reliable. Otherwise, if in the case of my students, right, and my fictitious students, if I were to administer this test, right, to measure anger, and today with the same temperature, the room is 100 degrees and their anger was very high, and then a week from now we do the same thing, but then their anger is not high, is it really a valid measure? Maybe I was measuring something else instead of anger, or maybe it's not a reliable measure. Maybe it does measure anger, but not in a consistent way. So notice that these two terms tend to be confused, and of course it's understandable why that happens, but keep in mind that it may not be, they're not used interchangeably. They mean completely different things. So hopefully after this explanation, things seem to be a little bit more clear for you. Now, let's go back to our slides. Now, something immensely interesting in the research methods and in our understanding of science is terms. Now, terms seem to be very easy, right? We think about terms like, well, I know what terms are. I know how to define love. I know how to define pain. I know how to define temperature, inches, right? So we think, yeah, I know how to do these things. But in reality, in science, the importance of terms is monumental, because we need to define a term to where it can actually be measured, pretty similar to how hypotheses are measured. And what do I mean? Well, in science, we like to think about terms as a construct. What is a construct? Is the phenomenon of interest that we are indeed trying to measure, like we were talking about with our little ruler, right? We're trying to define a term in a way that it can be defined. And I like to use this example quite a lot, which is, what is love, right? What does that mean, right? The term love can mean so many things for different people. So if I were to conduct a study about love, right, I would have to define that term of what love is, right? So if I define the term as, I'm trying to look into couples, right? If I'm a researcher and I'm trying to look into, okay, let's look into love between couples. Okay, well, what is love, right? Is it how much time is spent together? Is it how much time they cry together? Is it how much one buys things for the other? Is it, for example, how many fights do they have, or if they fight at all? So notice that the definition of that construct, right, in this case, love, notice how it is immensely important, because we're going back again to the validity. I want to make sure that I'm actually measuring what I'm trying to measure. So if I don't define it, how do I even know what I'm trying to measure, right? So it's immensely important to define that construct. It's immensely important to try to define that, as we will use it to understand our research later on, right? So we need to be perfectly clear on how we intend to measure, right? How are we going to define it in order to measure later on? Let's go back to our slide. So now we've mentioned the term variables, right? We've mentioned them before. Now, we did mention how the independent variable is that implies the manipulation. We define the dependent variable as that has the measurement. And we also talked about extraneous variables, which is generally things we cannot control, generally things that are out of our command when we are talking about an experiment. Now, when we're thinking about an operational definition, what does that mean? Well, that ties back into our construct. because an operational definition, it's simply a trying to specify the way, trying to specify the way that that construct is going to be measured. How is that construct going to be measured? So we need an operational definition. So for example, in the term, when we think about the term love, we can go to the dictionary and it's going to have a definition, right? But for an operational definition, I should say, I'm mostly concerned on how I can measure it. So these two definitions may not be the same. They are probably and more likely not going to be equal. So in research, you'll notice that people will define terms a little bit differently than how they will be in a dictionary, because most definitions in the dictionary are not intended to be measured. They're simply intended to provide a description. So when you're conducting your own research, or when you read research, you'll see how they define the term love, for example. How do we define pain? How do we define anger? How do we define mental illness, right? So when we are looking towards this construct definition, we inevitably have to think about that operational definition. How is it that I'm going to measure pain? How is it that I'm going to measure anger? How is it that I'm going to measure mental illness? So we would need to evaluate exactly how we're going to define a term in order for us to measure that variable. Now, when we're thinking about data, what do we mean by data? Data, it's simply what type of measurement are we doing? What type of measurement do we have of that data that has been collected? The information that has been collected is what we like to refer to as our data. Now, let's move on to our next slide. Now, when we're thinking about research, when we're thinking about what is going on, we need to draw a sample, right? So maybe you've heard this term used a lot in the medical field, like for example, your physician or your provider can say, hey, I need a sample of Mr. So-and-so's blood. I need a sample from Mrs. So-and-so, saliva, a urine sample, right? So you've heard this term before, but what does it actually mean? Well, in this case, the sample, simply put, is the who. Who are we looking into in our specific research? So the first who that we're going to look into is the population, right? So if you have watched one of the previous videos, you'll know that one of the terms that I like to, one of the samples that I like to use is, examples I should say, is inmates, right? So for example, we have a population of inmates, right? But there's millions of people incarcerated right now in the US alone. So a population means to that larger group, right? We're looking at that group that's immensely large. So, and a good example would be inmates. That's a huge group. That is a huge population. And here in your slide, you have all humans, all children, all women. So those are examples of populations. We're looking into an immensely large group. Now, we can also look at a small group, right? We can look at a sample. What do I mean by that? Well, a sample, it's simply a group that was derived from the population. So if I can give you an example. So if I can give you an example, let's look at the sample of an inmate, right? So if I have an inmate and I am focused more, okay, I want to focus on the inmates in Alabama, and I want to focus on the inmates, for example, that are in Blount County, right? So now I'm being more specific. I'm drawing from another sample, if you will. So now I'm drawing for a much smaller group. Now, these decisions will affect how much can you generalize a result, right? They're going to have an impact as to how you're going to generalize this finding. So let's think about how much I can generalize the results of male inmates in Blount County, Alabama. How much is that? How much can I apply that to, say, for example, female inmates in California, right? So there could be information that can be generalized, but there's also information that will not be generalized, right? So keep that in mind, that just because there's information from a sample, we also need to be careful about, okay, how much can I actually generalize the study? Now, interestingly, when it comes to a sample, for something to be a true experiment, we need to worry about randomization. So what do we mean by that? When something is random, we're trying to say that when we're drawing that group, right, when we're looking into that group, we're trying to say that it was randomly selected, that I actually had a random sample, because it gives everybody in that big population a chance to be reflected in the study, right? It's actually going to give us a good chance of how they are going to be viewed, right? Because it could be more, we can actually end up generalizing that result, right? So random selection simply means the opportunity that anyone can have to be selected for a research, right? So we're trying to give everybody the same chance, right? We're trying not to be biased, right? So I'm only going to focus on a type of inmate instead of focusing, okay, I'm going to select just inmates at random. So every inmate in Blount County, Alabama would have the opportunity to be selected to the study. Now that's different from random assignments. What do I mean by that? Random assignment is, remember, we're talking about the control group and we were talking about the treatment group. So here, let's look into how we put that participant in our group. So for example, I randomly put them in the treatment group and I randomly put them in the control group. So I won't have a bias necessarily as to which group each participant is going to go to. You can do that by simply flipping a coin, right? Because it was by chance that you went to the treatment group, or it was by chance that you went to the control group. So it gives the person the same opportunity to be in the treatment or control group. Now, in a design, we like to think about our different methods that we can use in order to conduct and answer our research questions. Now, we did talk about our designs, and I want you to understand that each design is valid, right? So a case study is valid, the naturalistic observation is valid. Those are more related to our methods. Now, if we want to be a little bit more specific, always remember that experimental methods are the best way to determine cause. Now, the thing about other forms of research, for example, descriptive, we can sometimes come across ethical problems, right? We can actually come across instances that will be and will have some ethical concerns. Now, for that reason, we want to ensure that we have proper controls. We also have boards that study the type of ethical implications that we may have in our study, in our research, I should say. So keep that in mind. Now, we were talking about experiments earlier, how we have a true experiment. Now, a true experiment, we have multiple factors that are significant for something to be a true experiment. First one, the independent variable has to be manipulated. I have to be able to control that independent variable. I also have to be able to measure the dependent variable. So if I don't have those types of concerns and applications in an experiment, then I simply cannot, I will not have a true experiment. Now, keep in mind that in order to have a independent variables, for example, the example that they're giving us is if we have a face stimulus, right? How are people going to react to this stimulus? we would have one, for example, control that it's only exposed to normal faces. And then the treatment one, we can have one that has inverted faces to see whether or not there's a relationship in how we interpret and recognize faces. So notice that we also need a control group in order for a experiment to be a true experiment. Now, earlier I was talking about quasi-experiments and a quasi-experimental approach. Now, this is what we like to call a natural experiment. Why is that? Well, that's because we cannot manipulate the independent variable in an experiment, in this quasi-experiment. So notice how I wouldn't be able, for example, to control the sex of a participant. I won't be able to control and manipulate the age of a person, right? Their personal history, what they've been through, right? So these are things I cannot manipulate, right? So if you remember the example that I gave earlier about hurricanes, if I want to measure the impacts of a hurricane in mental health, I cannot physically create a hurricane. So that will be considered a quasi-experimental approach because I simply cannot do it. I simply cannot manipulate certain variables. However, we can select these variables. So for instance, I cannot create a hurricane, but I can select individuals who have experienced a hurricane, a severe hurricane, right? So I can select people based on their sex. So for example, I only want to look into male participants, or I only want to look into persons who are teenagers, or I only want to look at persons who have been coached in softball, right? So that will be those will be examples of sex, age, and personal history. Now, I can't change their sex, their age, or their personal history, but I can certainly select these people. So that will make it a natural experiment, a quasi-experiment. It's not a true experiment. Now, the thing about that, we also don't have a random assignment. I cannot assign people into the groups, right? I cannot say, well, you are a man and you're going to be in the man group because I turned you into a man, right? Or I can say, voila, I'm looking for students who are 5 years old, but voila, you're 20, now you're 5, right? So that would be impossible. I cannot assign you to that, but I can select it. For example, I can select, say, okay, I'm going to focus on males and you're going to be in the male group and I'm going to have female group. So that I can do, but I can't actually do that type of assignment, right? Because you simply already have it, right? You already have that characteristic yourself, right? Now, interestingly, however, even though they're not the same as true experiments, these statistical procedures are actually the same. You still use the same statistics to measure the significance of these factors. So keep that in mind. You will have to use the same ones. You are able to measure and use the same statistical procedures, although there are some statistical measurements that are solely for true experiments with random assignment and things of that nature. But you will cover that more in detail whenever you are working in a research class. Now, remember how we were talking about the ethics, right? We're talking about the ethics of a particular study. Now, generally, we will have boards that are solely focused in understanding the ethical consequences and implications and consequences of your study. So there are some questions that simply cannot be answered via experiments because they would be unethical. So if you remember the video that I was showing earlier, right, that we saw earlier, let's think about how ethical would it be for me to grab a child and put them in that feral state, right? How ethical would that be, right? So of course that wouldn't be ethical. But I can draw from a sample who was actually in that situation. Now, I wouldn't be able to assign participants either, because that will mean that I will be able to assign a participant to abuse versus participants that have not, right? So notice that that's also a significant complication. Because of that, we wouldn't be able to conduct experiments. And we also need a board that can review our study to make sure that we are conducting things in an ethical manner. So that's when we have the IRB. And this stands for Institutional Review Board. Now, universities have these types of boards. Usually when we conduct a study, they are generally affiliated with a university. So generally when we conduct a study, the IRB will be the board that will review your research. And I can tell you from personal experience, it is a very, very extensive process. They want to make sure that you as the researcher are doing things in an ethical manner in accordance to your field. So for example, if you're in psychology, if you're in social work, whatever the case may be, there are ethical standards, I should say, rules of conduct that apply to your ethical standing in research, right? So that's what they utilize to make sure that you're doing things in an ethical manner, and also the legal standards, right? So for example, doing things in a legal fashion that is not going to harm that participant. Now, generally IRBs are present where there is federal funding for that university. So that's something to take away as well. Now, generally, when we are conducting research, before you even look at a participant, before you draw from that sample, the IRB is going to scrutinize your proposal, right? This is what I propose for my research. And I can tell you that they will review that information before you even propose, before you even actually conduct your study. So they're going to look into a proposal just to ensure that, yes, you are in fact approved to conduct this study as you have presented it to us. So you have to have everything in line. So for example, what questions do you have? What's the hypothesis? How are you going to measure this hypothesis? What instruments are you going to use? How are you going to collect your sample? What are the risks implied with your study? How are you going to inform them of the risks that are implied and that are inherent to your study? So notice there are dozens of questions that go into you having yourself, your research approved for an actual study. So there is a difficult process to that. How do we let people know? How do we inform them about the risk associated with a study? Now, with anything, whether that be, let's say, whether that be therapy, research, any form of interaction, you need to remember that there is an inherent risk with any sort of interaction that you may have, for example, with a student, with a client, with a research participant. There's always an implied level of something that could happen, right? So for example, with students, we show them a syllabi, so that way they know what to expect. With clients, we give them their informed consent, and so they know the risks and benefits and their rights when it comes to therapy. With research participants, we also give them an informed consent, because the participation of research has to be voluntary, right? If we are forcing an individual into research, not only would that be unethical and arguably illegal, but also it wouldn't give you the results that you're looking for. Because if I'm being coerced into doing something, that's not how I would normally conduct it in the first place. If I am coerced into drinking orange juice, that's not how I normally drink orange juice. So my reactions to that are not going to be typical. So that's why we want research to be voluntary, because we do truly want it to be a true manifestation of that dependent variable. How do we do that? How do we actually do the informed consent? Now, the most important part of an informed consent is that it's going to let that participant know about the procedures that you are conducting, right? It's going to let them know about what exactly will happen in this study. The second factor of an informed consent is that it's going to inform this person of the risk. There's always a risk involved with any form of research, whether it be a small risk, a significant risk, or a very severe risk to their participation. Now, the IRB is going to ensure that the smallest level of risk is in place, right? But there's always an implied level of risk. And because of that, we have to include what are the risks associated with your participation in research. Now, something interesting about the research and the informed consent is that you must let them know that this participation is voluntary. You have to inform them that their participation is voluntary and that they're able to withdraw at any time. That is their right as a participant. They are entitled to be able to participate voluntarily, and if they choose to not continue the study, they should be able to do so. But they must be informed that this is it, that this is a possibility, that if they wish not to continue, that is totally up to them. Now, another thing is that in the informed consent, we have to let them know how is it that we're going to protect their privacy. How is it that we're going to try to either ensure confidentiality or ensure their anonymity. Now, generally in research, we can have either or, right? So we can have a study where the participant remains anonymous, or we can have a participant where their information is confidential, I should say. The main difference is with anonymity, we basically have no way to identify this person. Absolutely no way. Whereas when we're keeping information confidential, we have a way to try to recognize who this person is. Now, we can ensure confidentiality by saying, instead of having that person's name, for example, in my case, oh, Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and she's the one that's the participant, they can simply give me a number. So instead of being Dr. Ortiz, it can be like participant 1, 2, 3, 4, and the next participant is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. So that way it's a little bit more difficult to identify who the person was. Anonymity would simply imply I have no way to determine who that person is. So I think that's a good distinction to learn early on in your career, right? That a lot of people confuse confidentiality with being anonymous, and one is not the same to the other. They're actually not the same thing. Informed consent always has to let us know about the benefits. What is beneficial of this study? What gains come from this study? Whether it be for the participant, right? So for example, they may have a gain, or the knowledge, the gain of science, right? So what is science going to gain? What is the field going to gain? So whatever potential gain you can find, whether it be towards the participant or the greater field, that you have to write those down. You have to let that person know, yes, in fact, there is a benefit to science, or there's a benefit to, for example, the participant. And as I mentioned earlier, the freedom to withdraw. This is important because their participation is voluntary. They can do so at any time before they even get started, right? Before they're exposed to that independent variable, even if they agreed, they can withdraw. If they want to withdraw during the examination or the exposure of that independent variable treatment or intervention, they can do so if they choose to do so. Now, another thing is they need to understand that if they withdraw, that there is no cost to them, that there's nothing that they will lose by saying no. So some people, a lot of the participants are people who are undergraduate students, right? So for example, let's say I'm conducting a study, right? Let's make up this fictitious example. So let's say I have a study to conduct, and I tell my students, hey, if you participate in this study, you're going to gain insight as to how research works. Maybe you can gain some extra credit, but I don't want it to be construed as if you leave, you're going to lose credit, because there can be a loss if the participant chooses to withdraw. So that's really important. A lot of people think that, oh, if I withdraw now, that's going to harm me in some way, or it's going to cause a detriment, or I'm going to have some repercussions because I decided to not participate. But in reality, we have to let them know that they do have that freedom. Now, Another thing they need to be informed of in the informed consent is if they will receive an incentive, right? So some studies will pay you with a coupon so you can go to certain stores. Some studies will pay you with, here's a gift card to Amazon, or here's a gift card to Walmart. So there is an incentive. For students, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the incentive could be, hey, you're going to get 50 points if you participate in this study. So that's another form of incentive. Now, we never want to make that incentive so great that it will bias the participation, right? Because we want people to not be coerced into participation. So if I say, hey, if you participate in my study, you're going to get an A in my class. Well, most people would say yes to that. But in reality, we want to give that person the freedom to decide whether or not that gain is beneficial and that will not bias the study as well. So if I were to say, yeah, if you participate in my research, don't worry about it, you don't even need to take tests or anything, here you go, here's an A for the class. That's actually a form of coercion, because now I'm trying to manipulate your voluntary, or how voluntary your participation actually is. Now, interestingly, when we think about consent, now, the only people that can consent are adults, right? Adults that don't have a physical or psychological impairment to where they cannot make that decision on their own. But sometimes we have participants that are children, right? So for in the state of Alabama, the age majority is 19. It's not 18. And a lot of people get that confused, but in Alabama, it is not 18, it is 19. Now, if you're less than 19 years of age, in Alabama or in other states, right, 18 in other states, if you want to participate in a research study, you would have to bring an informed consent form from your parents, because in that case, they are your legal guardian and they have assessed the risks, the benefits, the gains of you participating in this research. Now, it's important to note that every experiment will have its own consent form. When you conduct your own research, hopefully, when you go to graduate school or for a master's, doctorate, or if you decide to become a researcher, remember that you will have a consent form for your research, and it's going to include all of these previous elements that I had discussed. So hopefully this presentation has helped you understand some of the factors that are involved in research methods, scientific method, and the parts that are involved in conducting, say, for instance, naturalistic observation experiments and things of that nature. So hopefully this was beneficial for you. Thank you and have a great day.